do our announcements while they kind of join us slowly. Welcome to Iowa Lakeside Laboratory. I think everybody in here is a friend of our laboratory. It's been around for a while. So just a couple of announcements before we get started. Next week we will have Dr. Durr talking about her book, The Lived Nile, and connections to place and rivers, and she's coming in from California. So, and I think she's got a connection to you, Zach, is that right?
Well, she doesn't know me.
No, but your writing is kind of informed on her, based on her work. Okay,
Yes,
so
yes.
there might be a little discussion, connection there. Tomorrow we have a presentation for Wild Wednesday, which is kayaking and s'mores, I believe. And then I believe we have something on Thursday. What are we doing? Writing, journaling, and collages, I think. So we had kind of a wellness discussion. So next week is Dr. Durr in this building. Tomorrow's Wild Wednesday. And just stay tuned. Follow us on Facebook and keep up with us. Tonight we're very pleased to have one of our faculty members. Dr. Brent Mortensen has been teaching ecology as well as restoration ecology. So he's been sticking with us for 6 weeks now. I'm really excited to have him come chat with us. But we're excited to have him kind of share his perspective on the world. So please join me in giving Dr. Brent Mortensen a big welcome.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to try to talk to you guys a little bit tonight about some of my research, looking at how plant species coexist, how herbivores affect that. A lot of times when you go to a talk like this, you walk away thinking, wow, that person's brilliant. That's not going to happen tonight. Partially because I'm not, and partially because I really want to speak to the crowd that's really struggling through early career, trying to figure out where they're going. And I want to show you that it's not easy, and there are a lot of failures, and there's a lot of pitfalls. So when you hit those, you're not alone. So that's the comedy of errors portion of the show tonight. I love this picture. So I am teaching restoration ecology, so I feel like I gotta give homage to that a little bit tonight. On the left, we have a prairie that I helped restore or reconstruct from nothing when I was a graduate student at Iowa State University. Immediately next door, we have corn, right? So over here in prairies, we can have a place where we can have, if it's a remnant original prairie, 150 species in 10 acres, right? Over here, ideally we're shooting for one. Right? So how do they coexist with one another? Why don't we end up with just this one dominant species taking over the landscape? I'm going to talk a little bit about that and the role of consumers or herbivores in all of this. So before I go any further, I really want to give some background to why this is important, why we even care about all this. These graphs come from 2 separate studies that were done. So here on the left, we're looking at years since an area was restored. And up here, we're seeing percent cover of grasses just shooting up, and then forbs just dropping. This isn't a tall grass prairie. And historically, prairie was not grass. We call it tall grass because physically that was the dominant vegetation on the landscape in terms of the height. But really, it was primarily forbs, these flowering plants. And we see that dropping off. Another big study that was done looked at a chronosequence, or a series of prairie plots that had been planted in different years. And they found that as ages got older, we started losing species richness. Why is that? Why can't we hold on to species in an area? Obviously, there's something that we don't entirely understand. We're making a lot of progress on this. Right? So the big questions that I'm going to talk about tonight in relation to this bigger problem is, one, how do plant species coexist? And two, how do their consumers, what we call herbivores, how they contribute to that coexistence? So I want to step back and talk about this in more of a conceptual model sort of way. So we're going to simplify this a whole lot. We're going to look at just 2 plant species to start off with. So plant species 1, plant species 2, and they're sharing some resource. So these dotted lines indicate that these plants are sucking up the resource, they're consuming that, and they're pulling it down. and then the resources having a positive effect on the plants. They're not directly competing with each other in this little model that I'm showing, other than they're competing for this resource. Well, we would expect that one species should be better than the other one at getting resources. So we get a bigger, thicker line right here. Pull them up a lot faster. It's more efficient at using those things. So if we draw this out on a graph, we end up with a number line kind of like this one. So here we're looking at amount of resources that are available for the plants to grow, from low to high. And as we put the plants in this area, they're going to start pulling up resources out of the soil. And as they do that, they're going to grow and they're going to pull that resource level down and down and down and down. Well, plant one, it might be able to pull resources down to this point. At that point, it isn't able to pull resources out of the ground anymore, and so it hits an equilibrium. It's going to stop its population growth, it's going to hold steady there, sucking up resources as they become available, but not pulling more than that. Well, species 2, in this example, it can go a lot further. It can pull it down farther. So if we're just thinking about this one resource that they're competing for, one plant species is going to win. Right? In this case, plant species number 2. And plant 1 is going to go extinct. Well, let's look at something different. So, oh, by the way, we call that the R star rule because we're looking at R for resources. I'm talking about P star rule. In this case, P stands for predation. So what we see now is 2 plant species that are being consumed by a shared herbivore, a consumer. And plant number 2 is not very well defended. So this herbivore has a big impact on eating and devouring this plant, less so on plant number 1. Well, as the herbivore eats the plant, that's going to fuel the herbivore population. We can make a lot more baby herbivores and they're going to go eat more plants and so on. So here, looking at our herbivore population, low to high, and as we put a plant down in this area, it's going to start being eaten, and the herbivore population is going to start increasing to some point that the plants can handle and withstand that herbivory. And in the absence of any other plants, it's kind of like the R star rule. They're going to hit some balance where they'll fall into an equilibrium with their consumer and their population growth. But in this example, plant 1's better defended, so it can withstand much larger herbivore populations. And it will fuel larger herbivore populations up to a higher level. Well, that's more than plant number 2 can handle, and it would go extinct in this scenario right here. Well, if we put these 2 things together, now we can end up with coexistence. So in this graph right here, we would start off with some amount of resource and some amount of herbivore population. The plant community is pulling down resources, pushing up herbivore populations, and we reach an equilibrium point. At this point right here, plant number 2 is held in check. It can't pull down the resource anymore because it's being held in check by the herbivores. And plant number 1 can't drive the herbivores up anymore because it's being held in check by its limitation on the resource. So this allows coexistence, but this coexistence assumes that there's some sort of trade-off, that no one plant is good at everything. Something that's very well defended is going to be a very poor competitor. Something that's a really good competitor is not going to be very well defended. Well, the problem is that doesn't always work out when we go outside and actually look at things. These are just a number of studies that I pulled up some years ago. This one right here is showing that granivory or consumption of seeds by birds and rodents was totally indiscriminate, regardless of defenses. This paper right here actually showed preferential herbivory on rare species, things that we would consider to be less competitive. Here we see preferential granivory of the rare species, not just indiscriminate, but again, going for the rare ones. Preferential herbivory on rare species, preferential herbivory on rare species review, so this was pulling all sorts of studies. And this was a meta-analysis that was done that looked at a number of different research studies that had been done. And what they found was they looked at this competition defense trade-off that I was talking about, and they actually found on average that there wasn't a trade-off. things that were better competitors were also better defended. Now they did note that when there was a trade-off, that there was higher diversity, but that doesn't always happen in nature. So what's going on with those plants? So a study that was done using the Nutrient Network, a project that involves researchers from around the globe. I'm a part of this. We were trying to figure out what sorts of trade-offs exist with plants. And we found in general that the trade-off is there's fast-growing plants that are poorly defended, there are well-defended plants that aren't very fast-growing, and we get that balance that allows coexistence. And these graphs are showing all that. Particularly right here, we're looking at a trade-off between defense and competition. And I don't really want to get into the weeds too deep here on what all this means. But I do want to point out, there we go. These guys are sitting right here in the middle. Here in this red box, we have species that are very, very good competitors. They're not really trading off with defense against herbivory. Here in the purple box, we have species that are very well defended, but they're not trading off with competition. And then conversely, we have species that are very poorly defended, and they don't seem to have anything else going for them. Or species that are really poor competitors, but they suck at everything else. How are they holding on in this place? Well, this is where I'm going to start to try to give you some answers. There's two projects in particular that I've worked on in the past that I want to talk about. And I picked these projects, one, because I don't get to talk about them a lot. And I think they're very, very cool, and you're a captive audience, and you are not allowed to wait until I'm done. And then two, there are two projects that at some point I really banged my head against the wall, especially the second one. So I want to show you some of those pitfalls that I've hit. So we're going to start with this first one. We're modeling plants and herbivores. So this requires a lot of math. And I can't tell you the number of times I was so excited to take my last math class. My freshman year, as a new college student, I took math for the last time when I took calculus. And then I found out that I had to take trigonometry. I begged and I pleaded to test out of it, and I was told no, so I had to take trigonometry. But then I was like, okay, it's my last math class. Until my sophomore year, and I found out that I had to take stats. So I took stats, that was my last math class. And then I found out I took the wrong calculus. So I took calculus 1 and 2 because I don't know, I look what for punishment. And then I was like, well, might as well just wrap it up. But that was it. And I was like, okay, I'm good now. And then I went to graduate school, and it turns out math's important. So I had to take regression and ANOVA and non-parametric statistics. But then I got my master's. Somehow I tricked them into thinking that I was qualified. And I went to go get my PhD. And I was convinced that I'm an experienced researcher, I know what I'm doing. And they said, no, you need to take multivariate stats. Math never escapes you. When I was an undergraduate, my advisor would always say, there's two things you have to be good at: stats and writing. You have to be good at both. So make sure you're doing well in those classes. But I never got away from math, so I don't know, at some point I decided to embrace the dark side and go over. And I started playing with all this, and I started modeling populations and trying to figure out, is there a way we can use all this to model what's going on with these plant species that are competing and have a shared herbivore. So this is just what I showed you before, right? Nothing new. We can model the amount of plant mass in a particular area, and this will increase as they consume a resource. But we have two species competing for that same resource, so there's going to be some balance between them. You also have a shared herbivore. And as the herbivore consumes either plant, it's going to increase in mass, and as there's more herbivore, it can then eat more plants. So again, I'm not going to go too far into this because it's late and we just don't want to think math too much tonight. But what we're talking about essentially is what's called Lotka-Volterra population modeling. So in Lotka-Volterra, we can look at two competing plant species, or two species in general. And we can look at their abundance. So here's plant number 1, here's plant number 2. They have some carrying capacity in the environment. So right here we're looking at what point will plant number 1 stop growing. Now they're also competing with one another. And so what we're seeing right here is the effect of So we're looking at the carrying capacity of plant number 1 divided by its competitive ability, the competitive or effect of plant species number 1 on plant species number 2, effectively. And what will happen is, if they coexist, they'll hit some point where these two lines intersect, and that's going to plot their abundance for both species. Now, we can end up with cases where one species is more competitive than another, and so its population will go up. So in this case right here, plant species number 2 has gone up in population. Plant species number 1 has gone down in population, just a little bit. So none of this is new. This was figured out by very brilliant researchers a very long time ago, Locke and Voltaire. But I wanted to think about adding in that herbivore. Because if we add an herbivore, especially one that could increase the attack on species number 2, that could shift this line over a little bit, and we could increase diversity. We would go from having a community dominated, say, by plant species number 2, to something a little more even between them. So I started mapping this out. I don't want to scare you with these equations. That's why I made them tiny, right here. But if you want to nerd out with me sometime, I'm happy to do that. Essentially, this is what I'm showing right here. If I take maximum growth rates for a particular plant, that's the red bit, and I multiply that by the proportion of resources that are available in the environment, that's the green bit right there. And then I subtract out losses to herbivory, that's the brown bit. Then I end up with this equation, or this outcome of total plant growth. Okay. So proportion of resources available, I should also note, that includes what's available after competition. So all that's kind of added into that green term right there. And then down here, I have what's going on with that herbivore, the consumer. So its growth is going to be based on how much plant mass it consumes. We have to multiply that by some sort of conversion efficiency. How good is it at taking plant material and turning it into more tissue? And then how much tissue is it losing as it dies, as it respires, as it burns that fuel? And then the final outcome is total herbivore growth. So I took these equations and I started playing around with them, and I could come out with these different outcomes in the graph I just showed you. But they only showed me specific outcomes when all these variables were very, very specific. And I was really interested in trying to figure out, well, what happens when I change any possible number of combinations? So to do that, I had to take these equations, 3 of them, and I had to find their equilibrium. So for any particular value, when is everything going to come into balance and not change anymore? So probably one of the best things that could have happened to me in my PhD career is I signed up for a nutrition study because I was poor and I had no money, and they offered to feed me, which sounded pretty good. And they literally locked us in this room, I think for 8 hours, every Saturday for 4 weeks, while they would come around and they'd take blood samples from us. And so I had nothing to do. And we had absolutely nothing to do that's very conducive to doing work, right? So I'm sitting there and I start pounding through these things and just trying to figure out equations. And this is the whole series of equations that I worked through. And this looks awesome, but I promise you it was not. I can't tell you how many times I messed up a negative sign, somewhere like here maybe, and then I'd come out to the end and I would test it and it was way off. And I had to go through everything, and I'd find that one mistake, and I would fix it, and then it wouldn't work. And I'd go back and I'd find, oh, I messed up a minus instead of a plus, or a divide instead of a multiply. And I'd go through and I'd change everything, and I think I went through it 5 or 6 times. And this literally took me, I can't remember how many of these Saturdays sitting in this locked room figuring it out. But again, I'm not brilliant, right? I share this with you because I really want to illustrate the point that most of these big problems are figured out just through dedication and hard work, or in my case, more like stubbornness, is probably the right word. But if you stick with it, you can figure it out. And I eventually did. The end result was not a pretty equation. I'm not going to show it to you because it's frankly disgusting. But I was able to use it to make some very, very cool graphs. So the graphs I'm about to show you will be something like this. Down here, I'm going to look at attack rates on the x-axis. So as we go from left to right, we're increasing defense for a particular species. So as it gets attacked less and less and less, it's being more and more defended. On the y-axis, we're looking at the things that would be trading off with plant defense. So that could be its growth rate. It could be its competitive ability with other members of the same species. It could be its competitive ability with the other species. So the main idea is we're going to go low to high for growth rate or low to high for competitive ability. And we have 4 quadrants. So in these 2 quadrants that are marked in blue, that's where we'll find some sort of trade-off with plant defense. And that's what all the theory up to this point is suggesting is happening for species to coexist. This yellow quadrant, that's where species 2 is maladapted. It sucks at defense and it sucks at whatever this other thing is, growth, competition. The red quadrant is the opposite. Species 2 is the super species. It's good at everything and species 1 sucks at everything relative to one another. And then the graphs I'm going to show you are these heat graphs. Cool colors represent cases where adding an herbivore would decrease diversity. Warm colors represent cases where an herbivore will increase diversity or increase the balance between these 2 species. I'm just going to show you a couple right here. But what I found is that herbivores can increase diversity by reducing effects of competition. So these graphs are put in place just to remind you, we have trade-offs where we have the white, the gray areas are where we don't have the trade-offs. And this is what I found. So we can see that there are places, in this graph we're looking at a competition defense trade-off or competition defense relationship. And we can see places where we can have a super species, a super plant species that's really, really good at competition and really, really good at defense. And its competitor sucks at both of them. And herbivores can increase that plant diversity in these areas. Right here we have, look at the trade-off or the relationship between growth rate and defense. And there are still these places right here where the herbivores can increase diversity even though we have a super species present and a very, very maladapted species. So herbivores can increase diversity even when there's not this trade-off, which is what we always thought had to be the case. Now, what I just said. So what I got out of all of this, they can increase diversity by basically reducing the effects of competition. Even if they're preferentially consuming one species that's a maladapted species, they're still eating both species a little bit. And that can weaken the effects of competition between them, and that can help boost diversity. This also shows trade-offs increase the likelihood that herbivores will increase diversity, but it's not strictly required. And number 3, diversity may generally be the result of competition never reaching full force. So we can end up with a balance between all of them. So that's kind of the first thing I want to point out to you guys. So at this point, we know, okay, herbivores have this potential to increase diversity, even in suboptimal conditions in terms of what we would think of as these trade-offs. But what's actually going on in the field? Now, this isn't a direct relation to what I was talking about. This is another study I was doing. And I was looking at light availability and what's going on out there, and how herbivores will eat plants. That opens up the plant community a little bit. More light can hit the ground. It should be a good thing. What's going on? So if we look at the Iowa landscape, we've lost a lot of our big herbivores. Bison, elk, they're gone. So the big question is, can these remaining herbivores, deer, rabbits, insects, small mammals, can they increase plant diversity? Can they take us from a low diversity condition like this to something that's a little bit better? So I told you before about the nutrient network, this global network of researchers studying questions regarding plant diversity and grasslands. Early on, we published this paper looking at sites all over the globe and trying to figure out what is the effects of fencing out herbivores from a particular area, and also what's the effects of adding nutrients, alleviating these effects of competition, and how does that affect the plant community in terms of the number of species that are present. And this is what we found. So on the y-axis, we're looking at species richness change compared to when the experiment started. So if we add nutrients, we see that species drops off, species richness drops off. Fencing doesn't really seem to have any sort of effect. The interaction between these two things doesn't really seem to have much of an effect. And so the question became, well, why are nutrients actually causing species richness to go down? And so we looked at other things that were changing in response to these treatments. So up here we looked at biomass, how much plant mass is growing in a particular area. And we found we had nutrients, we had fertilizer, plants grow more. Right, that was news breaking right there. Fencing and the interaction didn't really affect biomass. So it's okay, well maybe there's something with this mass increase. So next we looked at the amount of light that was available. And we found, well, if you measure how much light is actually penetrating through the plant canopy down to the ground level where you have all these little baby seedlings just trying to make it, trying to survive. Adding nutrients, getting that extra growth is associated with less light availability. Fencing also is associated with less light availability, which isn't terribly surprising because if you fence out an area, you're keeping out these big animals that would eat and consume and create these openings. No interaction between them. And so we looked at more closely this relationship. You can see there's a whole jumble of points here from all over the place. But when we look at the regression, this red line popped out. If we look at the proportion of light that's actually penetrating the plant community, their canopy, it drops as the total biomass of that community increases. So at the end of this paper, we all pretty much concluded that there's this light limitation. Less light means less species can survive. Awesome. We got it published and everything was great. But that didn't quite sit right with me, and it always kind of bothered me a little bit because I was always wondering, does it really matter that much? And I never really did a whole lot with it, but it was always in the back of my mind. I kind of went about my business and I started researching different things. But I kept coming back to it. So if we look at other studies that have looked at the effects of light on plant richness and plant diversity, we see this total mixed bag of results. All these studies right here with the down arrow are showing cases where light had a negative effect on plant species richness. Total opposite of what we would have expected based on what I was just talking about. The green arrows show an increase. This paper was just inconclusive. These studies right here show that light can only increase diversity in mild environments, places that everything else was beautiful for the plants. Right? They weren't really limited by anything else. So I decided, well, maybe this is worth a closer look. We also know that shading can be beneficial to plants. So this is a picture taken in the US Southwest where the idea of nurse trees was very first proposed. So a nurse tree is where you have some tree that grows up and it creates shady conditions to help with a cooler environment, less evaporation, more soil moisture. And then other plants can start growing in the shade of these nurse trees. So if you go down to the Southwest, you'll actually find these trees that are just surrounded by cacti that can't make it out in the open when they're seedlings, but they can in the shade. And so shade obviously isn't always bad for these plants. So all this started to lead to some new hypotheses. So my hypothesis was moderate shading does not reduce seedling survival, and therefore does not necessarily reduce plant diversity. So the idea is that you have these harsh abiotic conditions, very high temperature, maybe low water availability. If the dashed line is negative, we're going to reduce seedling survival. So shading has this net positive effect on plants because shading will regulate these harsh abiotic conditions. They can reduce the effect of this negative line right here. Now, shading also has a direct negative effect on seedlings because it provides less light, and again, newsflash, plants like light for the most part. But I also want to think about other things that can affect shade. Well, community diversity can affect shade. A study that was done a very long time ago by Dave Tillman found that as you increase species richness, you see an increase in total plant cover up to a point. As you get more plant cover, you get more shading. So we would expect more diverse communities would result in more shading. So more diverse communities, by increasing shade, might have a net positive effect on seedlings. And just because, again, I'm a herbivore guy, and this is where I really put my brain with these consumers, I was thinking about, well, what do the herbivores do? Well, herbivores are going to reduce shading by consuming plant material. They're also going to directly attack seedlings, because that's what they're eating. So herbivores should have this direct negative effect on seedlings. But they should also have this indirect effect by reducing shade. And if I'm correct, shading has this net positive effect. So if we reduce shading, we reduce that positive effect on seedling survival. So I started playing around with this. And this is the other part where you're gonna be like, man, this guy's an idiot. 2013, I did this seedling demographic study looking at populations, and the whole thing just was inconclusive. A good study, if it works, is awesome. And if it fails, it's awesome. This just straddled the fence and did nothing. So I said, okay, well, I gotta do something new. So in 2014, a new field season, I did a seedling competition study. Inconclusive results. Again. So I did a seedling predation study, right? In 2015, I was in grad school for a very long time. When I was a PhD student, my first PhD advisor got a new job in Germany, and he offered for me to go, and my wife was like, no, I'm not going to Germany. So we stayed here, and I picked up a new PhD advisor, Brent Mortensen, who was fantastic. And he asked me to prepare a summary of all the projects that I had worked on, that I was currently working on, and their current status for him. And so I wrote this big, long report. And I remember giving it to him, and we set up an appointment to meet. And I go in his office, and the first thing he says is, "You must be the most unlucky graduate student I've ever met in my life." And it was all of this. So most studies don't work out. So I'm doing the seedling predation study. And I have a video I want to show you. I set up a trail cam. So this is a cage right here, and I set these cages out in a field, the same field where I did my restoration work. And some of them had holes cut in the side, so small mammals could get in. And I planted, I think it was something like 16 seedlings. 8 of them were purple prairie clover, 8 of them were lead plant seedlings. And I had worked really hard to grow these up. And you can see right here, this is right after I placed it, 9:21 a.m. We're gonna start going through this. In a short time, there's the first bowl. It's in there just eating like crazy. Yet already most of them are gone. There's one just kind of barely holding on right here, I believe. So it's now 1 o'clock in the afternoon of the same day. There's that little spot of green, that's the last seedling. Let's see. And it's coming up. There it is. It's gone now. What was that, 7:30? I came back after the very, and I expected there to be some predation. That's what I was studying, right? But I came back the next day. Every single plant was gone. Every one of them. Now, if that happened over the course of a few months, awesome, I could work with that. But I had no data. I had no way of showing that there was any difference in the rate of consumption. I sat there in this field, and I thought, do I really want to continue going to graduate school? And I decided, okay, let's do this again. So I went back to the greenhouse at ISU. I planted new seeds, grew new seedlings, and then in July I planted them again. That's when I put out the webcam. And I got this, same thing happened. They ate everything, right? And so, my seedling creation study just devoured. So, if you're a Monty Python fan, oh, it's twice. If you're a Monty Python fan, This is kind of how I felt at this point. If you know the reference, you're awesome. If you don't, you have some homework to do. My Python Search for the Holy Grail, you should watch that tonight.
Yep.
So what on earth am I going to do? Now, none of these studies by themselves gave me anything useful. But when I started to put them all together, they started to tell kind of an interesting story. I had some missing pieces, but I could get those. So those of you who are working on Bob, right, Baroque light, you guys spent a lot of time with that machine. Except yours is fancier and newer. But I was asking this question: well, how much light do plants actually need to survive? So if you get a machine like this one right here, you can hook it up to a plant leaf, and you can increase light intensity. And as you increase light intensity, you can measure how much CO2 is being sucked up by the plant, how much photosynthesis is it actually doing. And it makes a curve kind of like this one right here. And at some point, it hits zero. So at first, in the pure darkness, plants do not consume CO2, they produce it because they're burning reserves that they have. And at some point, they get enough light to balance what they're burning. We call that the light compensation point. And I wanted to know, how much light do plants need to hit this point? Like, what's their cutoff? So the plants that have been just totally devoured in the field, purple prairie clover and lead plant, I took those, grew up some new ones, put them in the lab, and started measuring light compensation points for them. So there they are. Aren't they adorable? Look at that. And this is what I got, was these lines down here. So this is measuring light intensity and micromoles of photosynthetically active radiation per square meter per second. These values right here are pretty low. This is a little lower than the light that we're experiencing in this room. I also started digging through the literature, and I tried to figure out who else had ever done anything like this on any plant that we would typically find in tall grass prairie conditions. And these were all the different plants that I found people had done work on. And these were the light compensation points. So, kind of scattered around, but these values are up to about 60. If you go outside in the middle of the day, right now, you're gonna have, and you look up at the sun, well, don't look, that hurt. But if you're out there in the full sunlight, you'd have a value of close to 2,000. Right, so these are very, very low numbers. So what did that actually compare to? I went out to the field and I used a photometer to measure light intensity on the ground, underneath the plant canopy, like this one right here. And I did that during peak biomass in late summer. And I pulled on data that had been collected at these nutrient network sites all over the world, because people were using that anyway. Specifically, I looked at sites all up and down the Midwest, so tall grass prairie sites. So right here, these box plots, are showing the available light at different sites all over the Midwest. So Cedar Creek, so in a control condition or in a case where we reduced herbivore abundance. So there's less light where herbivores are being kept out. Chaco Bottoms, down near ISU. Doane College, Halls Prairie, Kansas, Kansas. Here at Lakeside Lab. This is the site I was working at in Ames, Oak Ridge. High diversity and low diversity conditions. And this gray bar right here, that represents those range of values that plants need to break even. And so as I was looking at this, I was like, there's a lot of light out there. I don't think plants are starving to death in the shade. But this was only measured at peak biomass, so in late summer. And conditions are not the same throughout the year. So this is a photo point at the prairie that I helped to reconstruct throughout a single year, from March all the way up through August. You can see things change a lot. The plant community is developing, biomass is increasing. And even over the course of a day, we get differences in light intensity. So this is showing changes in light intensity over time, right? It goes up in the day, we get noon, drops off. Here we have a cloudy day where things were coming and going. So how much light is always available for these plants? So I went to 4 different prairies around Ames, Iowa. The reconstruction I was working at, Chaco Bottoms, another reconstruction. Anderson Dias and Doolittle Prairies, both prairie remnants. and I started measuring light. I went out multiple times through the year. I set these light sensors and these data loggers to measure light throughout the day. And I ended up with stuff like this. So this is a day-long light profile for a single site. Each color represents a different sensor at that site. And as you can see, light intensity goes up through the day, it peaks, goes back down. Throughout the course of the day, it kind of comes and goes as different shadows were passing over the sensors. But this dark black line right here, that is the maximum light compensation point that I dug up as I was reading through the literature. So again, most of the day, there's a lot of light out there for those plants. So this would suggest to me that these plants aren't starving to death because they're being shaded over. I went a little further than that. Based on the light readings that I got, I started saying, well, how many hours a day are we above this compensation point? So we have different sites. So I have Oak Ridge divided into a high diversity area and a low diversity area because we have different diversity plantings. The open circles represent hours of daylight, sunrise to sunset. These gray dots represent the number of hours in which we had a light intensity above the average light compensation point for those species. The black dots represent cases where we had more light than the maximum light compensation point. So there was always light out there. Oh, let's see. What am I getting at right here? Oh, I remember now. So if I take then the light availability over the course of the day, and I take then those light compensation points, I can go back to doing that thing that I tried to avoid my entire college career. I can do math. And I can actually figure out how much these plants are photosynthesizing over the course of a season. And so I can look at their mean photosynthesis per period, and I graphed it all out. And what I found was the dotted line, that's light compensation point. For most of the growing season, plants are above that point. So the numbers are actually located where we would have any one of these species. When it got a little crowded, I put dots in there with arrows pointing in. As we go through the season, some of these species might get a little crowded out, but remember these seedlings, they're growing too. So they're not always just hanging out right at the soil level. And with the exception of these two remnant sites right here, a lot of these other sites, they were hanging out above the light compensation points. So at this point I can say, for the most part, in a lot of conditions, most conditions, shade is not really having a negative effect directly on seedling survival. So let's go back to some of these horrific experiences that still give me nightmares when I did this seed predation study. So I planted my seedlings out in the field, and they looked like this after I planted them. And then I put these cages over them. And I told you about the cages, but I didn't tell you about this part. Half of those cages I put landscape cloth over to shade them out a little bit. Because I was kind of curious to see how that would affect predation and survival. Well, this is what they looked like the next day. Right? The herbivores not only ate my seedlings, you can actually see these little pits right here, that's where they dug out to eat the roots. Because they were just spiteful little things. But they didn't get everything. Now sometimes they actually would, the cages where I had fenced them out, there was no holes, sometimes they would actually dig holes to get in there. One time I even came back the next day and I found one trapped inside. You couldn't get out. I wanted to exact revenge, but I realized that that wouldn't be ethical, and so I let go. But they didn't get everything in these fenced out areas. So looking at just these areas where I had fenced out herbivores, I could look a little bit about survival. And I could figure out what's the effect of shade on consumptive death, death that was caused by some form of herbivory. So insects got in there too. So it turned out this year was just a record high year for voles and their populations. And for some reason, grasshoppers were also crazy. And they were just also eating wherever the voles didn't eat. So I looked at consumptive death. Then I looked at non-consumptive death. So survival by these seedlings where they died for some reason other than being chomped on. And shading reduced non-consumptive death. And then looking at total survival, survival went up in the shade. So what I'm doing here, right, is I'm taking all these failed studies and I'm starting to put them together, and I'm starting to realize, hey, all that work wasn't for completely nothing. I just had to take a step back and think different about what I was doing. So what it looks like is, yeah, definitely herbivores have a negative effect on seedling survival. That was definitely clear to me. But shading does seem to reduce these harsh environmental conditions. And by providing maybe less heat or keeping heat out, or maybe by preventing evaporation so you have more moisture in the soil, it was helping boost survival of these seedlings. Well, what about everything else, that plant community diversity element in that model that I kind of showed you? Well, we know biomass correlates with light availability. If you have more biomass, less light's going to hit the soil. Right? So what I did is I set these temporary exclosures all over my field. And I would leave them out there for 1 month, and then I would pick them up, and then I would clip all the plants that occurred in 2 little strips right here. And I would measure how much plant mass was inside that fence for that month. And then I would do the same thing just outside the fence. And I would compare those values. And not only could I then get an idea of how much plant mass was out there, I could also, by comparing inside and outside the fence, how much were herbivores eating from these areas. And so what I ended up looking at was this high diversity effect on mass. So the gray dots are what we call herbivore offtake, how much of the herbivores were moving from an area. And we can see what the effective diversity was on that. But I really want to focus on these dark dots right here. What was the effective diversity on total plant biomass? And we can see in July it didn't have a huge effect, but August and September, more diverse communities had a whole lot more plant mass. That's what I really want to focus on with this graph. Well, we can also then look at what is the relationship between diversity and death rates of those seedlings. Because I planted those things in the high diversity areas and in the low diversity areas. So here we're looking at ambient conditions. So this is just the full sunlight. Here we have, this is herbivores. So normal herbivore levels, reduced herbivore levels. And again, I'm not too interested in these grayed out points, but just so you know that's what's up there. But overall, diversity didn't really appear to have much of an effect on consumptive death. Didn't really appear to have this direct effect anyway on non-consumptive death, but it did have a positive effect on survival of seedlings. More diverse areas allowed, or I should say this another way, seedlings had greater survival rates in more diverse plant communities. So that suggests that plant diversity, which is increasing biomass, which is increasing shade, there might be having this indirect effect by affecting shade, which is then affecting these harsh conditions, which could increase seedling survival. So all of this kind of made sense to me, but I had to go back to this original study that I showed you before, right? This study that said, well, if we had nutrients, we reduce species diversity, and that's because nutrients increase mass, which decreases light. Light is associated with biomass, and so we think light is what is actually decreasing species richness in an area, the number of species around. So if it's not light, or if it's not shade, if shade is actually helpful to these plants, what is decreasing diversity in these areas? Well, I did not study this, but I was able to pull a lot out of the literature. I started digging really, really deep because I really wanted to graduate and I needed something. So what I ended up finding was studies like this. So in these graphs right here, they're looking at the giving up density. So giving up density is basically a measure of how much are the herbivores eating in a particular area. At what density of foods they say, okay, this is enough, I'm going to move on. So in sheltered areas, they stuck around for a long time and ate more food. The giving up density was lower than in exposed areas. These are small mammals that are eating, by the way, so mice, voles, little guys. They eat more on rainy nights than on non-rainy nights. So as I was reading more, increased canopy cover provides more predator-free zone, right here. In those cases, small mammals increase in number and foraging time. That's what this is showing. So essentially what's been shown is that small mammals, they like hanging out in areas with a lot of protections, shady places. Because if you're a small animal running around out there trying to make a living, and you're worried about a hawk coming down and killing you, you want to make sure there's something between you and the hawk, so the hawk can't see you, essentially. And this has been shown repeatedly in a number of different studies, in a number of different scenarios, especially for small mammals. So what I ended up proposing is that by creating these predator-free zones, or these safe spaces, increased shading actually increases predation risks by small mammals. If we decrease shading, or this canopy cover, we increase predation. I'm sorry, if we decrease shading, we decrease predation. So what this all comes down to is that herbivores really can have a big effect on plant diversity. As they consume plants, they open up the plant community. That will have a direct or this indirect negative effect on the plant community by creating these harsh conditions, high temperatures, low soil water availability. But at the same time, they're also affecting these other small mammals that are predating on the seedlings. So yeah, they have a big effect. Right? That's kind of the take-home message in all of this. So just kind of wrap it all up really quickly for you. In the first study I showed you, I dispute the common assumption that herbivores only promote diversity when defenses trade off. We don't have to have a trade-off. You can have a super species out there if an herbivore is present to help keep things in check. I also refute this assumed mechanism that herbivores promote plant richness by decreasing competition for light, and suggest an alternative mechanism for what's going on. So, in sum, herbivores matter. Right? This is me eating probably the last bit of corn in a cornfield right before we restored it to prairie. I'll leave it there. What questions do you guys have for me?
Questions for Brent? All right.
Who's still awake? Oh. Hey, David raised his hand.
So if less shade means there's less refugia for small herbivores, but it also reduces seedling survival because of those environmental conditions. Is it more beneficial to be less shady?
So my research would suggest that, the problem is my research is fragmented. So I've been looking for a long time for students that want to pick this up and continue doing it. I have not been able to recruit anybody yet, because I really want to run this experiment that I originally intended from the very beginning, looking at this interactive effect of shade and predation. Because yeah, it looks like we have two things going on here. Shade is having this sort of almost like this indirect physiological effect on the plants that seems to be beneficial, but it's also affecting the predator, so the small mammals. So what's the relative importance of those? My research so far, based on this, shows it depends on the year. In the year I did it, it didn't matter. They just ate everything. But if you do it in a year with fewer predators, I don't know. That's a really cool question. It's one I want to answer at some point. And what's the relative importance of those two things?
Yeah.
I was going to ask you a simple question. If your prairie area has been gobbled up by all the herbivores,
Yeah.
does it have a chance to restore itself? I mean, has it got enough
yes.
root system that it can?
Absolutely. And in fact, herbivores are really critical components to those prairies. So focusing on just the little guys that I've been talking about, they found that in cases where they do preferentially consume some seeds, they can have a massive effect on diversity, boosting diversity. So they are really important. In these species, when they do eat them, a lot of times they can spring back. As we get to bigger herbivores, bison, elk, deer, cattle, if they're out there, those can also have a very positive effect in the right concentrations. So just today, actually, I was out with my restoration class, and we were at a site that was just gorgeous, just south of Peterson. And it was just one of the best reconstructions I've ever seen. And she told us the story about how last year they put cattle out there. And they had only meant to have them out there for, I think, like 6 weeks. and they brought them all in, but a bunch of the cattle were hiding. And so 6 weeks turned into the entire summer, and they got them out in October. She said when they got out there, it was just barren. She said it looked like a poorly managed foraging land, forage area, pasture. This year, absolutely gorgeous. Flowers everywhere, forbs, they're in bloom. These species, once they're established, anyway, they're very, very tough, and they'll bounce back. Yeah.
This is more like a clarification, but in your first study you were talking about when there's kind of like one super species and one more like dud species, you said that even if the herbivores were like preferentially eating maybe the dud species, that could still increase total diversity.
So there are some limits to all that though. In that case, if it's eating the maladapted species more often, but it's still eating the other species sometimes, it can increase diversity. Now I did find that if the preference became too asymmetrical, the herbivore would decrease diversity because it would devour that maladapted species and eradicate it from the environment. So there are limits, but still there are certain conditions where you can have this maladapted and super species coexisting because of the herbivore. Yeah, great.
Did you find any symmetry or asymmetry in your experiments?
So I haven't actually measured them yet. So this is always the bane of people who do modeling, right? Is oftentimes the modeling gets ahead of what's going on in the field. So that would be the next step, is to go out there and look and see what are these competitive values, what are these growth rates, what are these defensive values. When I put these models together, I did dig through the literature quite a bit to see what are common ranges for these values from other species. So the graphs I showed you are within range of what we would expect based on what's actually been measured for these species individually. But the next step would be take some species, get these measurements for all these things on them, put them together, and then find out what happens, which would be a very cool follow-up study.
So Brent, this is looking at sort of open prairie. What if you put this in the context of like an oak savanna, where now you add a large bur oak tree? How does that change the dynamic?
Oh, that's interesting. So you'd be thinking about, first of all, you'd be thinking about a whole different group of herbivores. A lot of these small herbivores, they avoid large canopies like oak, like the plague. And in fact, you'll see seedling predation decreases. In fact, an earlier grad student working with Brent Mortensen did this study, where it's just like, it was almost identical to mine. She created these artificial gopher mounds, she put seedlings in there, and she did them at different distances from the forest edge. And she found that seedling survival went up the closer you got to the forest edge, because those small mammals were avoiding those areas, because raptors will perch up there and pick them off. So putting in these large trees is effectively the same as almost creating like an open canopy condition in the middle of the prairie. Yeah, that'd be my quick initial thought.
Other questions?
Yes.
What was your like academic support like along the way? Because I know you made the joke how you had one advisor that was like, "Wow, you must be the unluckiest grad student of all time." Did you ever get to a point where they were kind of like convincing you that you should start fresh, or did they just keep encouraging you to
Doing something different?
Did they encourage you to keep on going and try and find what you could?
I had a really good support group. I mean, when you first said what support did I have, my immediately thought was ice cream was my greatest support. No, my wife and kids, that sounds corny, but they actually helped me out a lot. My lab mates were really wonderful at helping push me along. But honestly, the biggest thing is, I had a goal that I wanted to work towards. I love teaching. I work at a small liberal arts college in Kansas, where most of my work is focused just on teaching. And that's what I wanted to do. So one day, this is getting a little off this, when I was a master's student in Alaska, I was working at a field site in the middle of nowhere. And as I was out there, I had probably been out there for 7-8 hours already. I don't know, because the sun's always shining. Lose track of time. This guy pulls up, and I'm at the end of a dirt road, like literally the dead end. And he gets out and starts talking to me. I think he was lost, and I'm giving me directions. And it turns out he was a professor from Florida who was up in Alaska visiting. I'd gotten lost, and we used to ask him about my research, and he actually told me some of the best advice I've ever heard when it comes to stuff like this. He said, keep your head down and work hard. He said, you're gonna see all these people that you went to college with moving on to new things. Some of them might be very successful, and it can get very discouraging as you feel like you're not making a lot of progress sometimes, you might be stuck. But he said, just keep your head down and focus on what you're doing, and you'll get through it, right? So that's what I did. I really focused on what is it I wanted to accomplish. Well, I wanted to get through this. I wanted to start teaching other people. And then even though this was hard, it was worth it. So think about what it is you want to do and keep that at the forefront. Oh, do we have time for one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So this is a kind of a silly question. What if you want to manage the thing on the right for low diversity? Can you use this same model and introduce some little predators to eat the weeds? Or what
Yes.
we call weeds?
You can. So, without getting into too much detail, the initial models I showed would also say as you add more nutrients. As you add more nutrients, that would cause some species to win out. And that's certainly one thing we're doing in these
for
fields.
sure, yeah.
But yeah, we can also preferentially consume the others. And we do that all the time with herbicides. Effectively, that's what we're doing. We're killing some things, we're just not eating them,
Well,
we're using
can you
chemicals.
use something biotic to do that?
We absolutely,
Instead of
yeah.
spraying them and
So,
herbicides, like
yeah.
this.
So we are doing that also. So additional research that was done by Brent Mortensen in open fields during the wintertime found that if you can figure out some way to encourage these small mammals to hang out in your field, they'll actually consume a lot of these weed species, seeds that are out there. So Ceteria, foxtail, they'll actually pick a lot of waste grain as well, which can be a problem for farmers. The trick they were never able to figure out what is limiting these small mammals in those fields. It's not shelter, it's not food, maybe, we don't really know what disease might be the next guess, but they never really looked into it. But yes, the data do suggest that if you promote these things, they can have a positive effect on crops by preferentially consuming the seed over the course of the winter.
Is it disturbance, you think? I mean, because then you go out there and drive around and do stuff.
Well, it wasn't just because they actually, and I went out with them a few times to do this. We do trapping out there in late winter, and populations were high, which is when they'd be eating all the seed anyway. So no, it's not disturbance.
Okay.
But yeah, if somebody really wants a cool research project or a graduate study, that would be a cool thing to look into. What is actually limiting these things out there?
Any other questions for Brent? If not, please join me in thanking him. And we'll continue the